we're going to be starting our unit on World War II. So you can write down Unit 6, World War II. And in this unit, we're going to have a lot of different sections of notes that we're going to be covering each day. But with this unit, even though there's going to be a lot of notes these first couple of days that y'all are going to have to take, you do have an extra week to work on all this stuff, because this week, if we were actually in school, we would have been in school Monday through Thursday, with Good Friday being off. But then we have all of the following week off, which we do still have that spring break that following week off. So I'm going to give you all that extra week to get all of this stuff done. So you don't have to finish all of these notes and have all your assignments done by this Friday, which is the 10th. I'm going to give you all until the 17th to have all of this stuff done. And today specifically, the first section of notes we're going to be looking at is what's been happening in Europe, which we haven't really talked much about what's been going on in Europe since the end of World War I. But World War I is directly going to cause World War II. And we'll look a little bit into how exactly that's going to be. Now, we know that at the end of World War I, the treaty that ended the war was the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles, if you don't remember, is going to do a lot of different things. In particular, something to keep in mind with this treaty is that the German people were very patriotic and they were very prideful, and this treaty was humiliating to them. As far as the treaty goes, it forced all of the colonies and territories that were controlled by all of the countries who lost the war, so countries like Germany, to give up control of all of those other territories. It also forced Germany to demilitarize. So Germany was not allowed to have a military at the end of World War I. Now, as far as this demilitarization goes, that doesn't mean Germany is never going to be able to have a military again. It's just they weren't supposed to have a military. Now, Germany's not really going to abide by that, but they technically, based on the treaty, were not supposed to have a military. We also have something called the War Guilt Clause that was in the Treaty of Versailles, which we talked about this in our World War I unit, because Germany is going to be the country that gets the total blame for World War I placed on them, which we know from World War I, it wasn't just Germany that caused this war. There was lots of other countries that were involved in it, but Germany is the ones that end up being placed with all of the blame. And then the big thing that we see having a major impact on Germany is that they are going to have to pay $63 billion in war reparations, which that $63 billion will have to start to be paid back in the 19-teens when the war ends. And it's actually not going to be paid back until the 2000s. It was around 2009, 2010 when Germany finally paid back the last of that World War I debt. So all in all, what you can take from this treaty is that the Germans were humiliated by this loss, but also they don't have a military. They don't have any of those other territories that they had going into World War I anymore. And they also are going to be paying a whole lot of money for this war. Now, as far as the Great Depression goes, we know the Great Depression is going to hit in the U.S. in 1929, but the U.S. is not the only country that's dealing with economic issues in the 1920s and 1930s. Germany is also affected by this depression, which during Germany's Great Depression, it's actually going to be so bad, the value of their money is so little that people are actually going to burn German money for fuel because it would get very cold in the winter months. And rather than just not having a fire, they would actually just burn the money, because that's how worthless their money was, because their economy was such a mess. Now, also during this time, we have a lot of leaders that are going to rise to power because of these economic crises that are happening. Now, in Germany, we know there's an economic crisis. In Spain, there also is going to be an economic crisis. There's a civil war that's happening in Spain during this time. And we have these leaders that are rising to power through this time. Now, these leaders that are rising to power, in Germany, it's going to be Adolf Hitler. And in Spain, it's going to be Francisco Franco. In Italy, it's going to be Benito Mussolini. But all of them are basically coming into power as leaders of their country because they're offering solutions to these difficult times. They're promising their people that they're going to bring them out of these economic crises, these political weaknesses that have been going on since the end of World War I, which Spain was actually neutral in World War I, but still they're seeing a lot of these economic and political issues nevertheless. But they're basically promising to fix things for their countries, which that hope that they're giving to their people is why so many people are going to end up following them. Now, as far as what we see happening in these different countries, in Germany and Japan in particular, we see a lot of militarism and imperialism start to happen as we get into the 1930s. Japan is going to invade Manchuria, which is a section of China, in 1931. Germany starts to remilitarize, even though they weren't supposed to. This violated the Treaty of Versailles. They're going to do it nonetheless. They're going to invade an area called the Rhineland, which the Rhineland is basically in Hitler's mind. They're German-speaking people, so he says that the Rhineland is rightfully should be part of Germany, which is how he's going to justify invading that territory. Now, at this time, England, being one of those main allied powers from World War I, sees Germany doing this, and they're going to respond with a policy of appeasement. Now, appeasement basically means that they are trying to avoid conflicts with other countries. So they're kind of going to allow Germany to get away with this for now because they don't want to have any sort of conflicts. Now, because England does this at this time, Germany is basically working their way closer and closer to controlling more parts of Europe. So first it starts with the Rhineland, and then they're also going to be looking to regain control of what Hitler is going to call the Sudetenland, which the Sudetenland is what would be part of Czechoslovakia. But as he's trying to invade these different territories and regain control of these territories, England is abiding by these policies of appeasement, not trying to get involved, trying to avoid conflict at all costs, which if you remember how devastating World War I was, it makes sense that England is going to be pretty hesitant to get involved in any more conflicts because they don't want to have another war like World War I. World War I was the Great War because of how devastating and how large of a war it was at that time. The world had never seen a war like that. So we really want to try to avoid something like that happening again, which is why England isn't really trying to cause any more conflicts at this point. Now, as far as all of this territory goes, you can see from the map here, we've got our area that's considered to be Germany and German-controlled territory. You can see the Rhineland on one side over here. This is the territory bordering Belgium and France with Germany. And then over here is where we start to get into our Sudetenland, which is that other territory that Hitler's going to be claiming to be German territory. Now, the Rhineland over here was that demilitarized zone. This is very much made up of that Western Front from World War I. So that's the territory. They definitely could not have any sort of military involvement there whatsoever. And then down here is the country of Austria, which Austria is going to be very important as we get a little bit later into the 1930s. If any of y'all have ever seen the film or the play, The Sound of Music, it takes place in Austria during this time as Nazi Germany is starting to get involved in Austria in the late 1930s. Now, what we also have happened during this time is our organization, the League of Nations, which was made to try to prevent future wars from happening, is basically not going to be effective. They can't prevent Germany from invading these other countries. They don't stop Germany from remilitarizing, and the League of Nations is very ineffective. Part of that is because the countries that are members of the League of Nations don't want to see another war happen, so they're not being super aggressive, trying to force these policies on Germany. And we also remember from our unit on World War I, the U.S. never got involved in the League of Nations because we never signed the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, we could not enter the League of Nations. So one of those major superpowers that was a leader and one of the victors of World War I doesn't actually play a part in preventing these things from happening moving forward. Now, as far as foreign policy goes, which I know this looks like a whole lot of information, so I'm going to kind of break it down for y'all. For the U.S., because we've been talking about what's going on in Europe, now let's look at what's going on in the U.S. The U.S. was going back to our isolationist policies for the most part after World War I. We agreed to what was called the Good Neighbor policy, which the U.S. was trying to get rid of a lot of its troops that we had in Latin American countries. We were also lowering tariffs or taxes on trade with those Latin American countries. So we're trying to get less involved in what's going on in some other countries. We also agreed to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which 62 countries agreed to, making war illegal. So definitely a lot of countries not wanting to see more wars happen, especially a war like World War I. We're agreeing to a lot of different neutrality laws, trying to keep ourselves neutral, trying to not have all of those entangling alliances that we learned about in World War I. We are also agreeing to these policies of appeasement like Britain is. So we're not wanting to cause conflicts. We're trying to stay out of things and use diplomacy rather than appeasement. But then in 1937, we can see that FDR gives a speech called the quarantine speech, which in light of current events, y'all know what quarantining is. But FDR's speech is sort of foreshadowing what is going to happen, because this speech is basically him saying that all the peaceful countries of the world need to try to quarantine the aggressive ones. If a country is being aggressive, peaceful countries need to prevent that aggression from getting outside of that country. We need to quarantine the aggression within that country and prevent war from breaking out. Now, this is in 1937. So FDR gives this speech clearly seeing some of what's going on in other parts of the world, especially with Japan and Germany. So clearly he had an idea that war was a possibility in the long run. He didn't think that everything was fine and dandy and that everybody was just being peaceful and we weren't going to have any problems whatsoever. He definitely knew that war was a possibility, and this speech is his way of sort of addressing that possibility and suggesting how our country should deal with these aggressive countries moving forward. Now, the big thing that's going to happen as we get into the later years of the 1930s, 1938, 1939, is we see that Germany is starting to get more and more involved in things that are happening with other countries. Now, we see in September of 1938, we have something called the Munich Conference. In this conference, we have different European leaders, in particularly the British Prime Minister, and then our leaders from France and Germany are all meeting to discuss German occupation of the Sudetenland and Austria, because Germany is showing an increasing interest in these territories. Now, from this conference, Germany agrees that he won't invade any other territories as long as he was granted control of the territory that he had already invaded. So basically, the Rhineland is the territory he's trying to control. Now, with this conference, the leaders of France and Great Britain say, okay, we're fine with that. Just don't invade anywhere else, and then you can have the territory that you have already invaded. So again, using that policy of appeasement, trying to prevent any further aggression from happening. Now, about a year later, Hitler's going to make an agreement with Joseph Stalin, who is the leader of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's now what was Russia. So Russia, Germany make this agreement known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And in this agreement, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin agree to a non-aggression pact. So they're saying that they will not go to war with one another. They will not be aggressive toward one another, regardless of what those countries have going on in other parts of the world. As long as they're not aggressive toward one another directly, then everything will be fine. Now, what we see happen September 1st of 1939 is that Germany invades Poland. Germany invading Poland is going to be the start of World War II, because this violates that Munich agreement that Germany had made with France and Britain the year prior, and this is going to be the beginning of the war. Now, as far as our causes of the war, because yes, Germany's invasion of Poland is that final spark that begins the war, but we do have a whole lot of things leading up to this. We've got the Treaty of Versailles, the fact that everything was blamed on Germany. Germany's in an economic depression because of all of that war debt and all of those reparations they're having to pay. And then we also know Germany and Japan both starting to use their military in aggressive ways, both starting to invade other parts of the world. We have the failures of appeasement. France and the US and Great Britain are all trying to appease Germany to prevent any more wars from happening, and that is not really going to work out. And then we also have the League of Nations failing to prevent any sort of wars from happening, and that League of Nations was really too weak to be able to prevent anything from happening. And then ultimately, of course, Germany invades Poland September 1st of 1939, and that is the beginning of World War II. So that's just our intro to World War II. In our later sections, we'll be talking about what's going on continuing from here.